the idea that this war started because Russia wanted simply territory, that they wanted to dominate and take over Ukraine, it's nonsense.
What they've done is grotesque. They've erased 100 Ukrainian cities to the ground, and where they can, they've slaughtered everyone in them.
No one is denying that the war in Ukraine is not gruesome. A lot of people are suffering. My point is that the idea that NATO is helping is nonsense. This is NATO's war. Nothing we're doing is actually helping Ukraine. They're an instrument, they're a tool. We're using them to kill Russians and weaken a strategic rival.
They loathe Russia because Russia drops bombs on their heads every single night.
I think you're going to see the Ukrainian military continue to unravel, its economy will unravel, and also the political system.
If Ukraine surrenders, its people and cities will be erased from the face of the earth, including the Ukrainian language.
Good to have you both under pretty interesting circumstances. I appreciate your time. I watch both your channels, so it's going to be an interesting conversation. And I'm going to kick it off with the latest developments. So it's like every day something happens. We have good news. Everyone's excited. The war is going to end. We're going to have a repeat of Gaza. We had a X point plan, I think 20-point plan in Gaza. We have a 19-point plan, 28-point plan that became a 19-point plan for Ukraine. Everyone got excited. And now Witkoff and Kushner left Putin and canceled their meeting with Zelensky. Reminds me of the time that they had a call with Putin and then they had a pretty heated meeting with Zelensky. Would love to get your initial reaction to the developments today. Putin's aide said that both sides reiterated known positions, no progress on the core questions of territory, and that the two sides are neither further nor closer to resolving the crisis. Glenn, what do you make of these developments?
Well, it's a very complicated conflict to resolve. It's worth remembering that this whole conflict began 30 years ago by the failure to develop a common European security architecture. Then, of course, the main red line, which was always problematic, would be Ukraine. We had the opportunity to resolve this war earlier on, but we rejected it, and then we've had all this fighting. So now, after all of this, the conflict only becomes more and more complicated. Now it's manifested itself even as a territorial dispute. So it's very difficult to get a resolution here. So the Russian demands are quite high, and it's almost impossible for the Ukrainians to meet these demands. So there will have to be a lot of pressure from the Trump administration. But given that Russia is winning the war, most of the pressure is going to have to come being aimed towards the Ukrainians to make concessions, because that's just the realities on the battlefield. So there's I think I don't expect a peace agreement coming out of this, but again, I could be wrong.
What do you? So I've got two questions, and I'll go to you, Jonathan. Just two quick questions, Glenn. You said that Russia's winning the war. Can you define winning? Because I speak to people on both sides. On one side, Russia is gaining territory, but very incrementally, and at allegedly very heavy casualties. And number two, what do you think is the main requirement that Russia has that Ukraine is not going to accept? Is it not joining NATO? Is it a territorial requirement, the Donbass?
Well, I would define victory as a victory in a war of attrition. That is, you would seek to exhaust your adversary. I don't think it would have been wise for Russia to simply gone for territory early on, because why would you storm well-fortified defensive lines when the Ukrainians are at full strength? Then you would deplete your manpower, your equipment, and for no good reason. This is not primarily a war about territory. So what you do in a war of attrition, you exhaust the adversary, and when the adversary begins to collapse, then you take the territory which you would require. But overall, this war began, as we learned from 2022, was a war of NATO expansion. This is the main issue that the Russians wanted resolved. That is, they wanted, again, in Istanbul, they aimed for neutrality for Ukraine, so no more NATO presence in Ukraine. Given that this has not materialized over the past 4 years, they've annexed all these 4 other territories, and now, of course, the conflict has become much, much more difficult. But I always make the point that if Russia has the option of having a neutral Ukraine and without NATO in it, they would be happy for example, Odessa to be a part of it. However, if Ukraine is going to drift into NATO's orbit, then I think the Russians would rather take Odessa. So I think that the reluctance to negotiate with the Russians is why this has manifested itself in a territorial dispute.
Jonathan?
Yes, coming on, I didn't think I'd agree with Glenn on anything because he's known for his positions that very much align with many Kremlin talking points, especially on geopolitics. But I do agree with him. This is not a war about territory. I think we would differ on the causes of it. But territory is really not what it's all about, nor does territory, I think, provide a key to a resolution of it. And this is one of the problems, I think, with the so-called peace negotiations. I think there's a massive misalignment between expectations on the US side. And this isn't just Trump. Now, he is extremely transactional, as we know. There is very little conversation about restitution, justice, or any of these things here. The debate seems to be happening on a very transactional level. But if this is not about territory, then there cannot be a simple territorial transaction solution to it. It's about much more than this. I would certainly differ with Glenn on the idea that this is about NATO. If NATO was looking to degrade Russia, they've been handed the perfect opportunity to do so, which is to degrade and destroy by pumping a lot more weapons into Ukraine. They could have caused a much bigger headache for Russia over the last 4 years, and they haven't. They've dithered. They've provided a fraction of what Ukraine needed. It's always been late. And in fact, of the announced military aid that's been given, Zelensky recently said that something in the order of 40% has actually arrived at the front. If NATO really wanted to destroy Russia, which is the propagandistic line coming from the Kremlin, then they could have done it so much more effectively. I also find that I agree with Glenn that this is become an attritional war, but I do not agree that Russia is winning and Ukraine is losing. Rather, I would maybe make the statement that both sides are losing. This has always been a struggle between two countries that have their strengths and their weaknesses, but ultimately it's a race to see who's going to crumble first, whose production capability is going to crumble first, whose ability to keep their economy going is going to crumble first, and whose allies are going to withdraw support. In Russia's sense, Russia has been kept in the fight by China, and Ukraine's been kept in the fight by Western allies. Neither have gone all in and given the full-throated support that would allow one side victory over the other. I find this to be an extraordinary state of affairs where perhaps the US and China do not want the balance of power to fundamentally alter, and neither have backed their side to an ultimate victory. So what we have is the image of two people sort of slugging it out who are not, let's say, fighting at the peak. Ukraine, however, we must remember, is far smaller. It has a smaller population, and it has had to make up for the differences where Russia has scale and resources. It's had to make up for this with innovation. It's had to make up for the fact that it's difficult to get the required quantity of people into, say, infantry regiments by innovating in terms of drones and so on. I don't like to call this a stalemate, but essentially the saturation of the battlefield with drones means that I think neither side can really achieve a breakthrough. We're in sort of 1918, if you want to compare it to the First World War. Military people will say that actually the First World War did end with something of the birth of maneuver warfare, and the German army experienced a catastrophic loss in Amiens. But at this point, I think we're in 1917-18, and it is completely bogged down because of the new technologies that have been developed. So neither side is winning militarily. And if you look at the losses on the Russian side, they are extraordinary. And we take that as a loss, but Putin's not counting the losses of men and material. I don't think he really cares about the lives of his citizens.
Glenn, there's a few points made there. I want you to start with NATO. How much more could NATO do to support Ukraine? And the point that Jonathan made, that China could also do a lot more to support Russia, and also giving us an update on your thoughts on the progress that Russia's having on the battlefield and the casualty figures on both sides.
Well, I think the casualty figures are just wrong. The Ukrainians are taking many times more casualties than the Russians. And you can measure defeat in a war of attrition. You can see the Ukrainian exhaustion, that is in terms of manpower, its military equipment, the logistics. You can see it in the economic sphere, that the economy is non-functioning. is completely dependent on the Europeans, which also can't afford this anymore. And you can measure it in international support in terms of who's actually backing it. Now that the US is walking away, I mean, if the US and Europe couldn't break Russia in all these years together, how can the Europeans do it together? So none of this makes any sense. You can look at social cohesion in Ukraine, where they have to drag the people out of their homes in order to send them to the front lines, while in Russia they are volunteers. So across the board, you see all the metrics going increasingly every day more and more in Russia's favor. Now, I would contest or the assumption here that is NATO support. I don't think necessarily that any of this should be seen as NATO support for Ukraine. Nothing that NATO has done has really had the support of Ukrainians at all. If you go back to 2014, what did we do? 20% of the population wanted to join NATO. Only a minority of Ukrainians supported toppling Yanukovych. We knew it would cause a war. We did it nonetheless. We undermined the Minsk agreement for 7 years. In 2019, when 73% of Ukrainians voted for peace, that is a peace platform of Zelensky, the US had its, let's call them fascist groups, threaten Zelensky, which was done very openly, covered well by the Ukrainian media as well. It was done with Western NGOs threatening, putting red lines for Zelensky not to implement the peace mandate, so we can use the Ukrainians as cannon fodder. And what we see now, while we were watching hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians die in the trenches, our politicians refused to even talk to the Russians to avoid some of the worst excesses of the war, and essentially said that, war is the path to peace. Even now, you hear German intelligence chiefs saying that we need to keep the Ukrainians in the war for a few more years so we can build up European defenses. I mean, we're using the Ukrainians. We're talking now about deporting Ukrainians to refill the trenches. The Germans are complaining that Zelensky allows his youth to escape the country because they need them there. I mean, nothing we're doing is actually helping Ukraine. They're an instrument, they're a tool. We're using them to kill Russians and weaken a strategic rival.
Jonathan?
I need to jump in because much of that, of course, aligns with classic Kremlin narratives and talking points. Much of it is not true. Certainly, there are some methods or some instances where people are drafted into the army against their will, but they're served legally draft papers, and that happened in Britain. That happened all over. It happens in every single war. What's happening in Russia, of course, is on a much greater scale, much more targeted against minorities. And the picture there, I mean, you won't get the film out of the country there, but I happen to have seen with my own eyes how that works. I was in St. Petersburg during the First Chechen War, and I saw the so-called Verbovka, where they seal metro stations, check everyone's passes, and if you don't have your military pass, you're whisked off to a frontline training station. That was Chechnya. Nothing has changed. That's the shocking thing. Nothing has changed in 30 years. So the amount of press ganging people into the army, and then the absolute contempt for how those Russian citizens are used, does not fall on NATO. It falls on Russian shoulders. But this argument about NATO is ludicrous. I mean, Glenn is right that the majority of Ukrainians did not want to join NATO, and in fact, it was not a realistic prospect. So where does this argument then come from, that NATO was a threat and NATO was going to use Ukraine as a proxy prior to 2014? It is an absolutely ludicrous statement because, one, really, Ukraine didn't want it. It was nominally neutral until Russia attacked. And every time Russia attacks, the desire to find an alliance that can help build some kind of security architecture only increases. Russia has created the problem that it claims to be fighting against. The other narrative that we have to tackle here is about Yanukovych and all the rest. I have met people who are in the room with Newland and her so-called cookies and all the rest of it that were used to sort of bribe and create an artificial coup. This, again, is another classic Kremlin talking point. I have the advantage of being able to talk to people in Ukraine, and I've talked to many, many hundreds, not just from metropolitan hipster Kiev, which, of course, was very much behind Maidan, they were there in force. But you also had people from Donbass, you had people from the east, you had people from the west, you had people from Mariupol, you had people from all over Ukraine, and you also had protests happening in towns across Ukraine. This was a mass movement which the US could not engineer in its wildest dreams. The CIA has never had that scale of power to organize that and mobilize people. So Maidan was an entirely organic event. And let's put it out there, the US actually tried to persuade the protesters, and they used the Polish foreign minister, they tried to persuade them not to go all in and confront Yanukovych, to actually find accommodation with him, even after on Yanukovych and quite possibly Moscow's instructions, they had shot 100 protesters dead using the feared Berkut, which is the paramilitary police. So all this stuff about Maidan is ludicrous. What it does do, however, is it does create the sense of threat for Putin, because what he doesn't want is a democratic, representative, pluralistic Ukraine that is succeeding and has the potential to succeed on the border of Moscow, because it shows to his people that a Slavic nation that has emerged from the Soviet Union can be successful. It's a template for Russians, which any dictator will fear. The last point I want to make is about these negotiations. There is a phrase, never negotiate with a terrorist. Russia is run by a mafia cabal that came out of the 90s, the chaotic 90s. Putin has acted as a terrorist in this war. He has acted as a terrorist really over the last couple of years and the wars he has instigated. What will not come out of this process is peace, because what you're essentially dealing with is someone with a mafia gangster mindset. If we align on 19 points, he will demand more and more and more. We've seen that template from history. So I'm afraid I do not have much hope that the current round of media frenzy is going to result in peace.
Glenn, I'll let you respond, but Jonathan, one quick question on NATO's expansion and how big of a role that played on the invasion. What do you think is the reason that Putin decided to invade Ukraine in 2022, and what would you say is I would say, what reasons are they, and how big of a reason NATO expansion was?
I think it's very low down in the priorities, and it's not to say that there's one magic bullet that explains everything. That would of course be childish, but there are many reasons why. But we need to try and, because no one's inside Putin's head. But I think NATO played a fairly minimal role in that, simply because he has always understood that NATO through the 90s de-armed to an extraordinary degree and never quite sort of built up that strength again. He would have known and been given the information that NATO did not have the capability and the investment to essentially be a threat to Russia. And I would argue at this point, NATO is something of a zombie institution, in that we do not have alignment between the different members of NATO. We have Hungary and Slovakia inside the alliance, undermining it essentially, and again repeating many of the narratives that Glenn has repeated here. And we have the US, who frankly, I think anyone who is sober will realize that we can no longer rely on US support. So Putin is looking at this and almost certainly rubbing his hands, because I don't think he believed NATO was a threat. Therefore, it is not a credible argument as to why he invaded. If he had thought NATO was credible, well, why did he not have massive troops massed on the borders, which touched upon NATO? In fact, I think it was the Leningrad regiments there that were strong in the Cold War were pretty much deconstructed and have had to be reconstituted in the last couple of months. No, he never saw NATO as a threat, but even he must be absolutely delighted to see how weak and disunited NATO has become.
Glenn, I'll let you respond to all the points made before we move on to NATO.
Well, there's been a lot of discussions around this in 1990s. It seems like the whole decade went down the memory hole. Keep in mind that in the early 1990s, we did sign agreements with the Russians for a pan-European security architecture based on indivisible security. That means you should not enhance your security at the expense of others. We're going to have a Europe without dividing lines. We already signed this with the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. But then Russia was weak. It seemed like it was kept getting weaker. So instead, we went with NATO expansion, the exact opposite, for the reason to create a hegemonic model for Europe to fit with the wider unipolar world order. that the US was pushing. The problem was that this revived the whole Cold War logic, the zero-sum approach to security. Everyone recognizes George Kennan said that this would restart the Cold War. The U.S. Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton made a point that it was extremely provocative, and he even said that the Clinton administration, the others in the admin who was in favor of it, also recognized that this was incredibly provocative. But they did it because, in his words, it didn't really matter what the Russians thought anyways, because they were weak and they kept getting weaker. The problem was when you not just restart the Cold War logic, but you expand all the way up to Russia's borders, you reach deeply divided societies such as Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, where they lean almost half each way. And what you do when you ask them to choose between East or West is you instigate a civil war. You rip these societies in two. And given that it's not only a domestic issue, you will also have then the Russians leaning in on one side and NATO leaning in on the other. And this is what would first create civil war and then a proxy war. This isn't even my argument. This was also the argument of William Burns back in 2008 when he predicted, he was, again, the ambassador to Russia in 2008 and became then the director of the CIA, and he was making the same point, that this was the reddest of all red line, and if we would do this, it would instigate a civil war, and then Russia would most likely intervene on the side of the eastern Ukrainians. This is why Angela Merkel said that offering NATO membership to Ukraine would be a declaration of war. I mean, no one in Moscow was even talking about laying claims to Crimea before 2014. They knew where this was going. That is, we're not going into Ukraine to help them build democracy or support human rights. They're an instrument, they're a tool against Russia. Again, the day after we toppled the government in Ukraine in 2014, according to the New York Times, the first thing the US did was to have the new intelligence chief they had installed in Ukraine to call MI6 and CIA to establish a partnership. This is according to New York Times, against Russia. So this was long before the Russians even took Crimea. And they had to rebuild them from scratch because the Ukrainian security agencies, they had been only a few days earlier, Russia had been their main partner. And now they had to be reorganized as a tool against the Russians. We saw the Americans capturing the political system of Ukraine. You had the general prosecutor of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, point out that all the new appointments in the government had to be approved by Washington. The Americans even put in one of their own as a finance minister. We saw them capturing the media, the civil society through these NGOs. Just saying Kremlin talking points, it doesn't really make much sense. This can be verified. This is from Western sources, from New York Times, Washington Post. Why are we calling this Kremlin talking points? I think it's...
I've spoken to hundreds of these same civic society activists, actually spoken to them in both English and Russian. And I can say that that's not what happened. These people are genuine, organic, yes, until Doge. Many of them were receiving part of their funding from the US. But I can tell you that if any of them thought that what they were saying was somehow scripted in Washington, it means you don't understand Ukrainians. They're very
both of you,
stubborn people. They will not take orders.
Could both of you be right? For a regime change to work, like we're talking about Venezuela right now, a regime change in Venezuela could succeed considering how unpopular Maduro is. Could both of you be right? Could Jonathan, I've spoken to Ukrainians, I was in Kiev, and there's a lot, there were organic support for what happened in 2014. And Glenn, obviously, it's hard to dismiss the amount of influence the US had. So I think the question is not whether the US had influence. I think Jonathan would agree that the US played a role in what happened in 2014. And also, it's hard to dismiss that there were, a lot of Ukrainians, I don't know if it's a majority or not, a lot of Ukrainians that wanted... I'm
not sure they played any role. I think they had no power and agency to prevent what was happening. Would have preferred it to slow down, quite honestly. In Belarus, actually, I hear that they were able to persuade the protesters not to go down the route of Maidan, not to resort to meeting violence with a degree of violence. Let's be clear, there was violence, but it was essentially in a form of self-defense. And look what happened to the protesters in Belarus. They were yanked out of their cars, beaten, tortured. Sometimes you have to stand up in more than just a sort of soft and liberal democratic way. I'm afraid the Nawfal team as well, who chose almost purely peaceful methods to resist Putin's regime, condemned themselves to failure as a result.
What do you make of all the examples that Glenn made, including the recorded call with Newland and Piat, for example, Jonathan?
Well, I've spoken to someone who's had extensive conversation with someone who was in the room. And I think that on the US side, there was an extreme amount of caution. We have to look back to the Chicken Kiev speech to actually see the tone. The US position wasn't, full speed ahead with, a pro-Western regime. It was literally the tone was slow things down. This is kind of scary. We don't want things flying out of control. And you were entering very unpredictable territory. I think the Polish representative from the foreign ministry basically came and said to demonstrators, look, we're aligned with the US here. You're going to fail and you're all going to be rounded up and this is going to be the end of it. You need to temper your demands for freedom. So I think that the reality is that the US was really not wanting to see a full-throated revolution, which is what ended up. And they have not wanted to see, unfortunately, Ukraine triumph over Russia and regain their territory. I also have to address this idea of civil war. Again, there are and always will be some people in Ukraine who don't really care who they're ruled by out in the east. But to say this was a civil war that then ended up into a proxy war with both sides using Ukraine as a proxy, I think it's sort of morphed into that to an extent. But this was not a organic civil war. And you just listen to Girkin Strelkov. He's very clear about what this was. This was a Russian orchestrated attempt to destabilize Ukraine.
Glenn, before I give you the mic, for example, John McCain in 2013 said Ukraine is seeking to, quote, bring about a transition in the country. And talks about what Nuland's role is. He said he's very pleased. How pleased he is that Victoria Nuland is with him on the scene, attempting to achieve his goal, which is a transition in Ukraine. But don't you think that hints that at least there was some influence by the US and NATO in what happened in 2014?
It went away eventually that perhaps they would have been quite comfortable with, but at the time I don't think they had any influence over it. Most Ukrainians I meet who were involved in Maidan even know who she was, and certainly were not receiving any guidance or narrative or material support from her.
One more example, Jonathan. Sorry, Glenn. I'm going to give one more example to Jonathan to respond to. Senator Chris Murphy said the following: I think it was our role, including sanctions and threats of sanctions, that forced and passed Yanukovych from office.
No. I mean, they're delusional. If they think that the US had agency in what happened, they're as delusional. And we don't have to look too far. I mean, you've got the current US administration thinking it can dictate terms to Ukraine. It shows they do not understand Ukrainians. Ukrainians will fight to the last by their own choice and their own agency. So these people can believe they have more power and agency in the situation than they actually do. Maybe that soothes their ego. Maybe that justifies the overinflated budgets that CIA and others get. They had next to zero role or control of what happened in Ukraine.
Glenn?
Well, again, as you suggest, or you argued, the call between Nuland and Piat 3 weeks before the coup, it was very explicit. They were talking about who should be in the new government after they got rid of Yanukovych, and they said who should stay in, who should stay out, and everything went just according to the way they said. That is, their guy Yats, he was going to take over. Klitschko had to stay out. So this is 3 weeks before, and as you suggested, they were quite open in the rhetoric about what the purpose. About what the purpose of it was.
He very quickly
you can also make the point that this isn't unique in 2014. We did the same in 2004. But I agree that there's a lot of popular support. That is, there was a massive anti-corruption protest. There were many people who are unhappy about the state of democracy in Ukraine. But what happened in 2004 is the same that happened in 2014. You had the US and NATO come in, hijack a popular movement and making it all about geopolitics. Again, the idea that America, which bases an entire security strategy on hegemony, that its goal was somehow to promote democracy in Ukraine, doesn't really make any sense, especially when the majority of Ukrainians didn't want to be a part of NATO either. This was also a key concern by NATO, by the way. Back in 2011, they have this paper that came out warning that after they lost Yushchenko, now the main problem was Ukrainians weren't pro-NATO. The constitution didn't permit it. Yanukovych didn't want to be a part of it. The Ukrainian population was overwhelmingly opposed to it. They recognized this as a threat and a challenge to further integrating Ukraine into NATO. So I just don't... I think the evidence speaks for itself. This was not organic. You take a popular protest, and then you hijack it. And this is what the American financed NGOs, which were developed for this one purpose, exactly that's what they did.
Glenn, the question I have for you is what is more important for Russia now? Is it Donbass, getting control of the entirety of Donbass, or is it for Ukraine not to join NATO?
NATO and neutrality, so that the Ukraine won't be used again in the future as a tool by NATO against Ukraine. And again, given that there's no trust in any of the deals, because we have broken every deal we had with the Russians from 2014, we broke the agreement for the unity government. We broke the Minsk agreement. We sabotaged the Istanbul agreement. So the Russians will also take the territories as a reassurance. But also some of it was purely pragmatic. That is, when they went into these places and conquered it, they needed to have rest on some local government. And if you plan to hand these territories back to Kiev after the war, of course, all those people would be massacred who helped the Russians. So it was a good way of building domestic support for the annexation or the occupation by declaring that you're going to stay. But overall, I think it's a requirement, a reassurance guarantee that no matter what happens in the future, that Ukraine won't have the same strength. Also, you strip Ukraine of key strategic regions, which makes them less appealing to NATO. So NATO might leave Ukraine alone in the future. But so no, I think this is why I think what the Russians want is Istanbul plus neutrality for Ukraine and territorial concessions without any security.
But Jonathan, before I give you the mic, if neutrality is their main, their core requirement more than territory, then why would they be okay with security guarantees for Ukraine? Ukraine does need to have security guarantees after being invaded over the last few years. And if they do get security guarantees, isn't that de facto becoming a member of NATO?
This is why I don't think they can have security guarantees. Again, the whole problem is we found this whole idea on deterrence, that deterrence is the only source of security. Ukraine had zero deterrence against Russia all the way up to 2014. There was no NATO there to help them, protect them from some Russian imperialism. What triggered the security competition was in 2014 when NATO entered through a coup. So I think, but of course now Ukraine faces a real threat, an existential threat from Russia. So it is a very difficult spot to be in, given that Russia's stripping it of key territories. And indeed, Ukraine might not even survive as a nation as a result of, now the Europeans prolonging this war.
Jonathan?
Well, we'll quickly jump to that one, of course, because at the current rate, it would take many, many decades to even occupy the territories which are now claimed by the Russian constitution. But let's go back to and the Russian economy is in it.
So I mean decades. Sorry. So how long? I thought it takes. Analysts say it takes 1 to 3 years for the Donbass. You're saying it takes more than 3 years for the Donbass and Kherson, Zaporizhia.
Yes, Kherson and Zaporizhia. It would take many decades at the current pace. Some military analysts have claimed, and another 2 million Russian lives sort of thrown into the meat grinder. Which,
assuming all else is equal. Purposes. Yeah, assuming Ukraine keeps getting the same. Sorry to interrupt. The analysts say, assuming Ukraine continues to get the same support from NATO, is that one of
to get the same? Ideally, it would get more, to be frank, because they have budgetary issues, and not resolving, the issue of Russian central bank assets means that there are huge holes opening up in Ukraine's budget over the next 2 to 3 years. So there are many things that need to be resolved there. What I was going to say, lost the train of my thought there. No, let's quickly hit this idea.
The original question.
Minsk is important because one of the architects of the invasion of Crimea is someone who I've long studied, who's a fascinating and extraordinary, I would say, evil genius behind part of the Russian campaign here and the Little Green Men and the invasion of Crimea, and that is Surkov. Surkov is on record as saying that he did not plan for the Minsk agreements to be fulfilled. And it's been widely reported that Russia broke those with impunity from the very start. But I think Glenn's point that there's no real security is correct. I do not believe at this point that NATO provides credible security. But what we're also missing here is that it's not just NATO. If Ukraine were to become part of the European Union, there is some implied sort of security that goes along with that, or at least the onus on Europe to respond if it's attacked again. And I think this is the elephant in the room, that it wasn't NATO expansion that perhaps triggered this. It was the idea in Moscow, very unpalatable, that Ukraine would join European Union. That would accelerate the reforms that were helping to tackle corruption. And let's face it, corruption in Ukraine in the 90s was extraordinary. It was in some ways it was higher in the 90s than it was even in Russia, and there it was absolutely rampant. It's the threat of Europe and the European Union and becoming part of that rules-based order, which we've seen what's happened in Poland. Their economic growth has been accelerated into an extraordinary fashion. That economic growth, that rules-based framework, then allows expenditure on the military and real defense. This, I think, is the real elephant in the room, because we still have Ukraine on a path to joining the EU. I believe that is absolutely unacceptable. We all talk about NATO, et cetera, and territory, but really that has got to be a real sticking point for Putin. That is one reason why I don't think he will stop until he is, in his mind, erased Ukraine.
Jonathan, just one thing you said before we go to Glenn to respond. You said NATO provides no credible security. What do you mean by that statement?
At this point, it's an open question mark as to say, let's say there was an incursion in the Baltics or somewhere else, or let's say there was some at-scale hybrid threat to parts of Europe. It is not clear at this point whether all allies in NATO would render that Article 5 assistance to push back and counter Russia or even retake territory. Now, this is widely debated, of course, by analysts and military people, but there is not an absolute guarantee that Europe and other NATO allies would push back with force against Russian aggression. There's a question mark there. And of course, the Russian imperial mechanic works very well when there is the doubt about security or the ability to provide defense and deterrence. Something Glenn said here. I mean, if there's no credible deterrence, that is a green light for Russian aggression.
Well, no, I said the exact opposite. That is, there was no deterrent in Ukraine against Russia all the way from 91 to 2014, and no one in Russia put any claims against Ukraine. Well, what happened was, again, NATO entered, and this is what triggered.
Not direct kinetic, but they were interfering on.
This is what triggered a security competition. So I don't think Russia minds the EU much at all. There's been some comments, though, that as it aligns itself closer with NATO, that this is problematic. But to join a political economic club, I don't think that matters much to Russia at all. It's NATO that is the source of the war, and this is why they're worried about NATO. But about taking decades to take Donbass, this also doesn't make much sense. I've heard this argument as well, assuming that.
Zaporizhia,
yeah. Glenn, just correction. Yeah, Zaporizhia and Kherson takes decades.
No, I don't.
Yeah, and Kharkiv probably, which is in.
I don't think so either. This is a war of attrition. You have to accept that there's a collapse going on now in Ukraine. Keep in mind that in 2022, when the Russians went in, the NATO had built a massive Ukrainian army. They had built a lot of defensive lines, strong fortifications in Donbass, which is a heavily industrialized region where there's a lot of defensive positions to be taken up. They really dug in. NATO had huge weapon storages that they could pump into Ukraine. All of this is gone now. They have a massive manpower problem. Their army has been depleted. There's the defensive lines, especially after Pokrovsk now, are more or less on the Russian zone. And NATO doesn't really have the weapons to send.
I've seen them. That's categorically untrue.
Trump is now checking America more and more out of this war. Meanwhile, the Russians have only strengthened their army since 2022. They built up a very powerful army. So the idea that it would keep the same pace, the territorial pace, it doesn't make any sense. As I said, in the war of attrition, first you knock out the enemy, and then you take the territory when it doesn't cost you too much blood and equipment. And so now that you see the Ukrainian army unraveling, you're going to see the territorial acquisitions by Russia go much, much faster. And you're seeing this now. They're surrounding huge cities there, from Kupiansk, they took in Pokrovsk, Mironograd. Now they're going to take Gallipoli. There's a territory after territory they're going to be able to take now. They're cutting off supply lines.
fairly small towns, not
communications, and even the city of Zaporizhia, which is mainly on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, it could find itself encircled, and the Ukrainians would have to pull out of this major city as well if they fear that they could have their back against the Dnieper. So there's a lot of problems developing, and this is why, again, as we call everything Kremlin talking points, even the former advisor of Zelensky, Arostovich, he was making the point. If he was president, the first thing that he would do is go to Moscow and promise them that he would never let NATO again use Ukraine as a proxy that threatens the existence of Russia, and he would make us a deal on the territories as well. Not because the alternative to giving away 4 territories is 0, but the alternative to 4 territories is 8. So this is the best thing for Ukraine now. Recognize that the main thing to do to survive is to reduce the security competition. Don't be the main piece of NATO and Russia in competition, and take themselves out of this game. And I think that's the best thing they can do.
I mean, it has to be said that not a single Ukrainian I've ever spoken to, and that's many, many hundreds, find Arostovich in any way credible. In fact, most now believe what I've been telling them for some time, that he is quite probably a Russian asset, especially when you see him in Paris with Yulia Latina, who is spewing Russian imperial narratives like there's no tomorrow. And to counter Glenn there, I've seen the fortifications. Pokrovsk is not a big city. Kramatorsk is not a big city when you compare it to something like Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv, which is a vast, sprawling city. Russia does not have the capability to engage in a Stalingrad scale fight. So the idea of these places falling is not just improbable. It is ludicrous. That's not to say that Putin won't keep attacking. That's not to say that he won't cost many tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives and many hundreds of thousands of his own people's lives. He will keep pushing, I think, for as long as he can, as long as his economy allows. And that is one of the tragedies of this. He will not let go. And when the kinetic action ends, in whatever way it does, whether that is a freezing of the current front lines or some other arrangement, that doesn't mean the threat from Putin goes away, that suddenly he's going to be minded to cooperate and tolerate a free Ukraine. No, he will continue to interfere in Europe and Ukraine in every possible way. To counter Glenn's point as well, the reasons why the invasion didn't happen sooner is because you had a situation very much like Belarus and Georgia, which is that the administration, the intelligence services, the army even, were so infiltrated by Russian agents and assets, they had no reason at all to invade because the situation was very much under control. Very much under control, even under Yushchenko, who, of course, they very much objected to when he was viciously poisoned by the Russian intelligence services. He turned out to be ineffective, quite a poor team player, and indeed corrupt, as did the girl with the plaits, can't remember her name, of Tymoshenko. So Ukraine has been plagued, I think, by ineffective rulers, and for much of that period up until 2014, Moscow was able to manipulate and control through networks of oligarchs who had wide media holdings, as well as penetrate the intelligence services and so on. Despite US efforts, yes, to try and help Ukraine to weed that out and improve it, you had some pockets of excellence. But generally, Russia was very much in control of the situation. 2014 changed that. They started to lose control, not just of the administration and its decisions. They started to lose control of Ukraine as a whole. Now, yes, the West and the central portions moved much further and faster towards being more European-minded. But when that process started to happen in the East, and I've met many, many people from Donbass, from Mariupol, I've spoken to them in Russian. They were changing. They were becoming more Western-minded. They did not want to live under a kleptocratic regime. They did not want to live under the values of the Russian world. They were changing too. This is what was unacceptable to Putin, losing Russian speakers themselves to the West. That's the red line he couldn't stand, not NATO.
Glenn, I'll let you respond. Also, my question to you is, I agree with the advances that Russia's having, but also Pokrovsk, we've been talking about the fall of Pokrovsk for over a year now, and we've been talking about the collapse of the Ukrainian military for the last, since the beginning of the invasion, even before the Ukrainian counter-offensive. So how do we know this time is different, that this time the Ukrainian army is collapsing, as you say, and the advances will continue?
No, there's a lot of unknown variables, which is you can't say anything for certain. To what extent, tomorrow Zelensky can start to draft 18-year-olds. The Germans can start to deport Ukrainian refugees. You can have Trump changing his mind yet again, sending more powerful weapons. And anything can happen that would prolong the war. Indeed, this is part of the problem, that every time it looked like the war was coming to an end, NATO had to find out what to do. And every time it decided to escalate, that is to send more powerful weapons.
Do you think this time they'll do it? Do you think this time Trump or NATO could do it again?
No,
Europe or
because
Trump?
how would they build this army? They can't just make it from scratch again. I think they run so far out of so many people, they can't get enough people. Given that the war really has now become obviously lost, you see the desertions are going through the roof as well. There's no voluntary recruitment anymore, and again, the fact that the Americans are walking away from this is also quite important. But if I do want to push back on this, this talk about the Ukrainians, because this is the Ukrainians we always see in the media. There's the Ukrainians who want nothing more than to fight to the last man against the evil Russians. But none of this was reflected in any of the polls up to the coup in 2014. Indeed, this was a problem when, as you saw with the Gallup polls going all the way up to 2014, you saw that, again, barely 20% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. And you had Gallup polls showing how they associated NATO. It was like 14% considered to be about defense. If they had to choose, most Ukrainians would have chosen a security partnership with Russia, but the overwhelming majority said they would prefer not to choose. Actually, much like the Belarusians, they would like not to have to choose between East or West or made into a bulwark. They wanted to be a bridge, something that NATO did not,
Of course.
something that
What
NATO
happened?
did not permit.
What
And we even
happened?
talk now about helping Ukrainians. The last Gallup poll I saw was, I think, 69% of Ukrainians wanted immediate peace talks. The Europeans refused to even call Moscow. So this is just nonsense. There's a big effort to portray this ideal Ukrainians who hate the Russians as much as NATO does. It's not all the Ukrainians. I know a lot of hate has been created towards Russia, especially over the past 4 years, given all the destruction they have brought on Ukraine. But the idea that this war started because Russia wanted simply territory, that they wanted to dominate and take over Ukraine, it's nonsense. It's not reflected in any of the realities before the coup in 2014.
Glenn, just
I
want to
think
go
we
back
have
to the. Jonathan, I'll let you respond to everything. I have one more question
Yeah.
for Glenn. Going back to the peace agreement, you said something earlier that Russia will not accept any security guarantee. Do you genuinely believe that Ukraine will accept a peace deal without any security guarantees?
Well, it depends what a security guarantee is. If there would be some agreements that the NATO would have weapon storages in NATO countries, which they would then open up and said that they will ship it to Ukraine if Russia uses force against Ukraine again. Something like this could be acceptable, but anything that can lead to some kind of a mission creep where NATO gradually increases its presence in Ukraine until it becomes a de facto member, all of this is unacceptable. Because the main concern for Russia now is that any peace agreement will merely be another Minsk agreement. That is a temporary ceasefire so they can start to rebuild and rearm, and so the NATO can use Ukrainians to fight the Russians again in the future, hoping for better results. So this is what they can't accept. But if you can work around this and find some other ways for Ukraine to feel secure, then it could be positive. You don't want the Ukrainians to feel too vulnerable either. So. But this is the main challenge you have in international security. You want to manage the security dilemma. You recognize that you want to enhance your own security without diminishing the security of the opponent. And this is the solution we should have for Ukraine. That is simply saying more weapons, more missiles pointed towards Moscow, to the extent that the Russians fear for their existence. This is not going to be good for Ukraine. The Russians will then retaliate and do exactly what they do now, strip Ukraine of its strategic territory and destroy the rest. It's a death sentence for Ukraine, what NATO has done to it.
Jonathan?
NATO has not done anything to Ukraine. And let's get to that point that Ukrainians have been persuaded to hate Russians. One thing Glenn said is correct, that Ukrainians, up until 2014, and especially up until 2022, just wanted to be left alone. They wanted to be left alone to make their own laws, to figure out their own internal challenges and issues, to find their own balance between, say, the use of the Russian language and the Ukrainian language. It's absolutely, you didn't say this one, but I hear many do. It's absolutely not the case that it's illegal to speak Russian anywhere in Ukraine. I know because I've done it in wartime. You can speak Russian anywhere from one end to the other. You might not necessarily find people who want to speak back to you in Russian, but the hate, the loathing for Russians now, which is universal, not for the Russians, it has to be said, they're actually in Ukraine fighting, and there are some. Again, I've spoken to some of those. No, Ukrainians have utmost respect for those who are fighting Putin's regime, and the Belarusians and the Georgians who've chosen to do it on the side of Ukraine. They loathe Russia because Russia drops bombs on their heads every single night. And until you've been in that situation, you've heard the wail of the sirens and you've heard the buzz of the drones coming over your head, until you've had your child's primary school, your local hospital and clinic razed to the ground, until you've had tank rounds driven into the sides of your maternity hospitals. I have seen it on the approach to Kiev, roundabout Bucha. There is a maternity clinic with a giant great tank round in the side of it. Until Russians have destroyed your lives, your opportunities, your hope, massacred your children, in some instances raped your wives and your children. I've heard many stories of rape and torture. They haven't been taught to loathe Russians by the West. They've been done that through the experience of being at the sharp end of Russian aggression. They just want that to stop. So that Gallup poll tells us one thing: Ukrainians want peace. There's another thing that isn't asked in that poll, which is a little disingenuous. Do you believe peace is possible where Putin is the current leader of the Kremlin? They will all tell you no. They will also tell you what happens if Ukraine surrenders. If Ukraine surrenders, its people and cities will be erased from the face of the earth, including the Ukrainian language.
Jonathan, based on what you said just now, this is a war of attrition. As I said, I was in Kiev, and in Kiev you'd hear the sirens every night. People talk about the war.
You've
there's
seen
no
that,
daily life.
That, yeah.
Exactly. But I went to Moscow a few weeks afterwards, and life was relatively normal compared to any other country. So if this is a war of attrition, would you say Ukraine is a lot more exhausted than Russia at the moment?
No, they've chosen not to hit civilian targets, and they've had huge pressure put on them by Biden first, and now they're mindful that it would upset Trump if you saw mass Russian casualties. Now, some have been sustained in Kursk, of course, as a consequence of the fighting. Actually, many Russian casualties in Kursk were caused by Russians firing on their own people. That's another story. Now, Ukraine has chosen to fight this war by using their scarce resources to hit Russia's economy and to hit its fuel supply nexus. Now, there's dual use there, of course, but they have chosen a very surgical way to fight the war. Russia has chosen a very indiscriminate way to fight it. I don't think that attests to the physical strength or weakness. It does attest to the political and moral weakness of Russia, however, and the extraordinary moral courage of the Ukrainians.
Glenn, I'll let you respond to all the points, and I also want to get your thoughts on the change of strategy by Ukraine, striking Russia's shadow fleet, the main source of their income at the moment, to avoid sanctions. We had 2 strikes in the Turkish exclusive economic zone, and a third tanker that exploded near Senegal mysteriously. So your thoughts on that strategy, number one. Number two, how do you think Russia will respond? And they talked about landlocking Ukraine and striking Ukraine's ships and ports. And what do you think that would do to Ukraine and also food prices around the world, including Africa?
Well, I think it's going to make a lot of enemies for Ukraine. That is a tax on the civilian vessels of Russia. Now, obviously, I think that the Europeans, especially then the British, are probably involved in this. I don't see that the Ukrainians are pulling this off on their own. You already,
I hope so.
You already
very much
see that
are, yeah.
Kazakhstan is quite upset now because this also affects them. You see Turkey becoming also upset that they're attacking within their economic zone. And as you said, many other parts of the world which has the trade disrupted would also be angry with Ukraine.
I think the rest of the world that will be, but the rest of the trade will be disrupted if Russia retaliates and strikes Ukrainian ships. I think this is
Mario,
where
they've tried this.
Other countries...
They tried this in the first year of the war. They, they tried to prevent grain harvest from being exported, and they lost control of the Black Sea. So this has been tried. Let's just look at what happened there the Black Sea Fleet has been decimated and hasn't dared leave its home
Well,
ports.
yeah,
Glenn,
in terms of the other comments, no one is denying that the war in Ukraine is not gruesome. A lot of people suffering. My point is that the idea that NATO is helping is nonsense. This is NATO's war. NATO started this war. NATO made the point after triggering the war, they sabotaged the Istanbul peace agreement. What they did thereafter was block all diplomacy with Russia, stop talking to them, declare that it will be resolved on the battlefield. Then you have Zelensky drag young people out of their homes, and you send all the weapons you can in. And then, as multiple American leaders said, this is a good war. Even Keith Kellogg made this point. It's a good war. We get to use Ukraine to knock out a strategic rival, and we can focus on China. This has been repeated by many others. This is, America's not some Amnesty International with nuclear weapons. They have a very strategic interest which they're pursuing. And the idea that the Russians would erase...
Sorry, Glenn. How's that a good war if you push Russia more towards China? You lose the potential if China's your focus, shouldn't you get Russia closer as an ally?
No, exactly, and I think this is how Trump is pursuing a different strategy, because Biden he saw these two countries getting closer, so he thought that you can knock out Russia and then you can go after China thereafter. Trump recognizes that this has failed. So what do you do? Because the world is multipolar. What you do then is you try to reach out to Russia, as is the weaker part of this duo. And but then you have to end the proxy war against Russia. And this is what he's aiming to do, which is why you see in all of these peace deals, it's not just about ending the war, but you would like to get Russia on our side of the ledger. That is, the unipolar order is over. In unipolar order, you want to push Russia out of Europe to have a hegemonic Europe. In the multipolar order, you want to pull Russia closer to you to split them from the Chinese. So what the Americans are doing is quite logic. But I just want to make a comment about Russia going to erase all these Ukrainian cities after the war. It doesn't really make much sense. These are, first of all, the targeting of civilians have been minimal. How many civilians have died in this war compared to others?
I can't let that
and
pass.
Also,
what they've done is grotesque. They've erased 100 Ukrainian cities to the ground, and where they can, they've slaughtered everyone in them. So I'm not going to let that pass. That's a grotesque
How are you going to
lie.
erase all these Ukrainian cities? What would that do?
Bomb them into the ground, like Grozny, like they've done every time.
What would that do
to
public opinion within Russia? It wouldn't. They wouldn't.
They don't care. They don't care. They're indifferent. They've been indifferent to the 100 cities that have been erased. They've been indifferent to the population of Mariupol that was slaughtered on a far greater scale than even the Nazis achieved. I will not let that go, because people I know have had their relatives slaughtered in just this fashion and lost their homes. I will not let that grotesque lie
Anyways, you have
pass.
millions of Ukrainians living in Russia. You have Ukrainians fighting on the side of Russia, which is the Ukrainian army also recognizes that a lot of the soldiers they capture as prisoners of wars are people from eastern Ukraine. You even have the Ukrainian media pointing out that why are 100, 200,000 people moving back into the occupied territories which Russia hold. Obviously, if they thought they were going to be wiped out in some kind of a genocide, they wouldn't move back in huge numbers. This is also a war, as in all civil wars. Not that this is a civil war, but in civil wars, this is also a struggle for the hearts and minds of people. What Russia wants to do is also convince the people in eastern Ukraine that they're actually the same, and that they should, which is necessary if you want them to become Russian citizens. So the idea that you start wiping out entire cities, it goes against the whole idea of winning hearts and minds.
But that's what they've done, Glenn. That's the reality.
Final question to wrap, guys. It's been a great conversation. Jonathan, what do you expect to see in the next 2 months? Everyone's hoping for a peace deal.
There will be no peace deal. It will continue. But one thing I will say that Glenn said, it's unpredictable and very much depends on decisions taken in the West as to whether to support Ukraine further or not, whether the allies can coalesce or not, whether the central bank assets are handed over for the use of Ukraine or not. Certain things depend on these, or the outcomes depend on these. What happens in the Russian economy and how far China is willing to support Russia and what North Korea can provide. There are many variables that we don't know and which we don't necessarily control. What I will say is it's very unlikely, I think, that there will be peace, because the US and Russia are really talking at cross purposes. Putin's not interested in transactional gains and small territorial gains. that is not going to safeguard his regime, and there's not a victory for him. So this will continue, but the outcome is very difficult to predict.
Another great variable is what Trump would do next if these negotiations fail after today.
I'm not sure he knows from one minute to the next, so that's difficult to predict.
What he does.
Glenn, same question
What
for
is
you.
clear, he'll default to interests of the Kremlin, because whenever he's been persuaded by Europeans and Zelensky to see the world differently, it sometimes takes days, sometimes hours, sometimes weeks. He usually snaps back to aligning more with, let's say, sort of Russian interests.
But I think he flipped after the meeting in Alaska, so I'm not sure if we'll see the same thing again now.
That didn't last too long, and then he defaulted back to the behavior.
I agree that there's a lot of unknown variables, which makes a lot of this unpredictable. But overall, I think you're going to see the Ukrainian military continue to unravel. Its economy will unravel, and also the political system. And I think this is part of what the United States is doing. I think they're also putting a lot of pressure with these anti-corruption agencies to bring down some of the power figures within Zelensky's government to make them more willing to make peace. But overall, as the Ukrainian army begins to collapse more and more, I think the US will become much more desperate to find a peace agreement, so they don't end up with a collapse, while the Europeans will respond with more daring escalations to try to rescue the situation. So I think it's going to be a very dangerous time forward as the NATO is going to have to respond. What happens now that it has been defeated and its proxy is falling apart?
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.